In the early springtime afternoon in March of 1962, in the rural Nottinghamshire countryside, the residents of Home Farm in the village of Stubton are having lunch. Above them, at 16,000 feet, a Handley Page Victor bomber is carrying out a routine test flight to approve a new wing design for the new B-2 variant of the Victor. But their low-speed handling tests are about to turn catastrophically wrong, and the tranquil rural setting below will turn in an instant into a scene of utter devastation. In the late 1950s, Britain had brought into service 3 groundbreaking new aircraft types with which to carry the responsibility of the United Kingdom's strategic nuclear deterrence. Known as the V-Force, these 3 aircraft were the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. The Victor had had its first flight on the 24th of September 1952, and following considerable development work, it entered RAF service as the Victor B-1 in April of 1958 with No. 10 Squadron at RAF Cottesmore. It wasn't long, however, for the RAF to issue a requirement that the Victor should be able to achieve a higher operational ceiling, and so a modification programme began. Various changes were made, but of note, the wingspan was increased from 110 feet, 34 metres, up to 120 feet, 37 metres, as well as enlarged air intakes to supply more air to the new Conway engines. As part of the new wing design, weight-saving measures and simplification of its complex fixed droop leading edge were made. It was these new leading edges that had been rigorously tested and required signing off on the 23rd of March 1962. The aircraft chosen to carry out this test was Victor B-2 X-Ray Lima 159, which was based at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, the A&AEE, at Boscombe Down. This particular aircraft was very new, having achieved only 11 hours 30 minutes of flying time. The 5-man crew for the day consisted of Handley Page test pilot Philip Murphy. He was the captain for this sortie and sat in the left-hand seat. Aged only 28, but had amassed a total of 2,631 flying hours in his career to date, although only 155 hours on the Victor B-1 and 382 hours on the new Victor B-2. Alongside Murphy, in the right-hand seat in the role of co-pilot, was A&AEE pilot Flight Lieutenant John Waterton, aged 30. His flying career so far had accrued a total of 1,760 hours, of which 41 were on the Victor B-1 and 87 on the Victor B-2. Behind the 2 pilots in the rear crew section sat a 3-man Handley Page crew of 23-year-old Peter Elwood, acting as test flight observer, 25-year-old air electronics operator John Tank, and navigator Michael Evans, aged 26. The test flight for the day was a repeat of the test that had been carried out just the day before, again with Murphy and Waterton at the controls, and it involved reducing the speed of the aircraft, adopting a landing configuration of undercarriage down and flaps fully extended. The speed would be reduced further until the aircraft was at the edge of stall, to allow for assessments to be made on the performance of the new fixed droop leading edge. Reducing the speed further until the aircraft is just about to enter a stall before taking the appropriate recovery action. It was found on the previous tests to be coming out of the stall region by 110 knots. The flight of the 23rd of March was to reproduce these results. At 12 minutes past 1 on the afternoon of Friday, 23rd of March 1962, Handley Page Victor B-2 X-Ray Lima 159 rolled down the runway at the Handley Page Airfield in Radlett, Hertfordshire, and lifted into the air. Following post-takeoff checks, they set a course north. Shortly after 1:30 p.m, they were over the Lincolnshire countryside flying at an altitude of 16,000 feet, and following an uneventful arrival into the area, they were ready to commence the low-speed handling tests. It was agreed between the 2 pilots that Murphy would configure the aircraft into its landing configuration before handing over the controls to Waterton, who would carry out the stall and recovery procedure. The test began well, with Murphy easing back on the throttle and allowing the speed to reduce. As the speed came down, the flaps were incrementally extended until they were fully deployed. As well as this, the undercarriage lever was selected to down. He then handed over control to Waterton. All was well and going as expected. At 130 knots, the aircraft began experiencing the predicted buffeting, indicating the approaching stall region. Waterton continued to allow the speed to reduce. And in the left-hand seat, Murphy, who should have been monitoring the aircraft performance more closely, suddenly realised that the Victor was becoming dangerously slow. At 115 knots, the Victor suddenly dipped its port wing, followed by a yaw to port. The speed began falling away rapidly, and Waterton was heard to cry out, "Christ, 95 knots!" as he immediately pushed the controls fully forward, hard against the instrument panel. He was expecting to see a response to this extreme control input, but instead, the aircraft failed to respond. The Victor had entered a super stall, sometimes called a deep stall, as well as a flat spin. Captain Murphy resumed control of the Victor and began a desperate attempt to recover from the situation. To his horror, the elevators and rudder were completely ineffective, and the Victor remained in a flat spin and was losing altitude at a rate of 600 feet per minute. With the aircraft and his 5-man crew passing through 12,000 feet, Murphy realised the inevitable and ordered the crew to abandon the aircraft. No sooner had this command been given and the rear crew door was opened. Murphy looked over his shoulder, and from his limited viewpoint he could see that the centre and right-hand seats belonging to Evans and Elwood had been vacated. He therefore reasonably assumed that they had already left the stricken Victor and were descending in their parachutes. Unfortunately, although John Tank, who had been sat closest to the door, had successfully bailed out, his crewmates Evans and Elwood had become disoriented in the spinning aircraft, and although had left their seats, were still on board. Still battling with the controls, he turned to his co-pilot, who was declaring mayday over the radio, and instructed him to eject. Without hesitation, Waterton reached up to his seat-blind firing handle and pulled it down over his face. A brief pause, a loud bang, and the canopy was lifted off, followed by another loud bang as his seat main gun fired, propelling him clear of the aircraft. Murphy now realised that there were no options left, and he too pulled his ejection handle and left the aircraft. The Victor was just 300 feet above the ground as he left the aircraft. Meanwhile, whilst all this drama was unfolding, below them in the quiet rural village of Stubton, Nottinghamshire, stood Home Farm, and their normally peaceful day-to-day life was about to be shattered. Farmer Dennis Burt and his wife were just finishing off their lunch. They were in their dining room just clearing away the lunch dishes, and in the kitchen was housekeeper Mrs. Annie Gibson and nursemaid Miss Cecily Gibson. Their attention was quickly drawn to the sound of an approaching jet aircraft, but the sound on this occasion was somewhat different to what they would normally hear as RAF jets flew by. Mr. and Mrs. Burt both dashed over to the dining room French windows to investigate what was going on. As they did so, at 1:58 p.m, the spinning Handley Page Victor crashed directly onto their farmhouse and exploded. The blast hurled Mr. and Mrs. Burt through their French windows and into their garden. Dennis Burt suffered a broken leg and a broken pelvis, and his wife was badly burned by aviation fuel, but they were alive. Inside the house, however, in the kitchen, both the housemaid Annie Gibson and the nursemaid Cecily Gibson were both killed instantly. Inside the wreckage of Victor X-ray Lima 159 were later found the bodies of Michael Evans and Peter Elwood, who, despite their efforts, were unable to bail out before their aircraft hit the ground. The rear crew were trialling a new personal equipment connector, which connected their flying suits to their seats. When they were given the order to bail out, nearest to the door, air electronics operator John Tank simply ripped this connector from his seat as he left the aircraft. Evans and Elwood, however, struggled to free themselves. When Murphy looked over his shoulder and saw the centre and right-hand seats empty, this was immediately prior to the crewmen struggling to return to their seats in an effort to release their connectors, something they ultimately failed to do and which tragically cost them their lives. The 3 crewmen who did successfully abandon the Victor all suffered severe injuries, but survived. A board of inquiry convened on the 13th of April 1962, and it was concluded that the primary cause of the loss of Victor X-ray Lima 159 was that the aircraft was allowed to enter a deep stall in such a way that recovery was most improbable. A deep stall is particularly dangerous for aircraft that have a high T-tail design, such as the Victor. Where there are benefits to be had in placing the elevators a considerable distance away from the airflow over the main plane, when a stall occurs with very little forward velocity, the wake caused by the turbulent air over the stalled wings can totally envelop the elevators and rudder, resulting in no effective airflow over the surfaces. And so any inputs from the pilot will therefore be useless. At the time of the accident, there was not a general awareness amongst the air crews that the Victor could actually be placed into a deep stall, and no discussions had ever taken place between Handley Page or the test pilots, something the inquiry was particularly critical about. Recommendations followed that further wind tunnel tests should be carried out to investigate deep stall recovery, using things like power settings, brake chute deployment, and cleaning up the flap and undercarriage configuration. Following these wind tunnel tests, further test flights were carried out, this time with only 1 rear crew member accompanying the 2 pilots, to investigate new procedures to prevent and recover from a deep stall. These new procedures would be adopted into the standard operating procedures of the Victor B2. Thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.